My name is Harold Desjardins. I am 78 years old, and I was born in Watson Lake, in the Yukon Territory, in the year 1943, to a trapper named Gustave Desjardins and a Cascadena woman named Agnes Squirrel, who became Agnes Desjardins the spring before I arrived, and who outlived my father by 31 years, and outlived most of her grief by perhaps 20. I spent 34 years as a game warden for the territorial government, which is a fact I mention not for pride, but because it is relevant to the kind of man I am, the kind of man who counts things and measures distances, and writes in notebooks, and does not, as a rule, say anything he cannot stand behind in a court or in a church. I am telling you this because what I am about to say will sound, to most people, like the story a man tells when his mind has begun its slow departure. I want it on record that my mind has not departed. I want it on record that I know the difference between a thing imagined and a thing witnessed, and that I have been sitting with what I witnessed on the 17th of November, 1958, for 64 years now, and that I have told no one, not fully, not the way I am telling you now. My wife Madeline knew. She was the only other person still living who did, and Madeline died on the 19th of January of this year. 6 weeks ago, as I speak into this recorder, and when she died, she took with her the last reason I had for staying quiet. She made me promise, years ago, that I would tell someone before I followed her. My granddaughter, Clara, has asked me to tell it properly. She has set up this recording device on my kitchen table, and she has asked me to take my time and leave nothing out. This is what I told the recorder. My father, Gustave Desjardins, was a large man, lean and careful, with hands that were disproportionately broad even for his frame. The hands of a man who worked with rope and steel and cold water more days than not. He was born in 1987 in Abitibi, Quebec, and he came west in his 20s, following work and following a particular quality of silence that he said the boreal bush near Watson Lake offered that no other place he had ever been could match. He spoke about silence the way other men speak about women or about money, with a kind of reverence that made you understand. It was not really silence he meant, but something inside the silence, some quality of presence he could not name in either French or English, and so described always by negation, by what the bush was not. He was not a sentimental man. He was not a man who used words like beautiful or spiritual. He said once that the Liard watershed was the almostest country he had ever known, because it would kill you if you were wrong about it, and it would sustain you if you were right, and there was no opinion in it either way. I believe this is the closest he ever came to a declaration of love for any landscape, and I count it as one of the 2 or 3 most eloquent things he said in his life, which is a life I am still in the process of understanding. He ran his trapline out of Watson Lake from the spring of 1938, which is to say from his 21st year, until the autumn of 1958, which is to say until the year he died. That is 20 years of the same country, the same routes, the same creeks and ridges and spruce stands and muskeg crossings, the same distances walked in the same order, the same camps built and struck and built again. A trapper's relationship with his country is unlike most other relationships between a human being and a landscape because it is entirely practical and entirely intimate at the same time. Because the man does not visit the country, but lives inside it for months at a stretch, and because the country responds to his presence in ways that are specific and cumulative, and that a man who has been in the same bush for 20 years begins to read the way a doctor reads a patient's face. My father knew that country. He knew which creek ran high in late October and which one held a frozen shelf of ice that would carry a man's weight and which one would not. He knew where the moose bedded in the November cold and where the marten ran and where the fox crossed. He knew, I believe, a great deal more than that. But this is the part of his knowing that I can account for directly. What I cannot account for directly is the 14 years before his death, during which my father was a different man in the bush than he had been before. I did not know this at the time. I was a boy and then a young man, and what I understood about my father was what I observed in him at home, which was that he came back from the fall trapping season later than other men, and that he went out earlier in the spring, and that in the weeks between these departures and returns he was quieter than he had been. When I was small, a quality of quiet that was not unhappiness, but something more like a man who is waiting for something and who has learned to wait patiently. My mother understood it differently. She told me after he was gone that starting in the autumn of 1944, which was the year, she believed the change began. My father brought gifts back from the bush that he had not brought before. Not furs, not meat. A stone of unusual smoothness and colour, placed on her windowsill without comment. A bird's skull, perfectly intact, small enough to sit in the cup of a palm, which he set on the kitchen table one November morning, and which she kept in a glass jar on the shelf until the day she moved in with my sister. A piece of birch bark, folded in a particular way that she had never seen before and could not replicate, and that held its shape for years afterward without unfolding. She asked him once about the bark, and he said only that he had found it that way and thought she might like it. And she told me that she believed him and did not press further, because she was a woman who understood that some knowledge was not hers to have, and that pressing for it would change the quality of the thing more than the knowing of it ever could. I did not know about the gifts until after my father died. I did not know about the sounds until Victor told me. Victor Alphonse was 36 years old in the autumn of 1958, a Cascadena man who had trapped the country east of my father's lines since he was a young man, and whose family had been in that country for longer than anyone thought to count. He was not a large man, but he was the most physically capable person I have ever known in a long life of knowing capable people. He could walk 40 miles in a day on snowshoe without giving evidence of having done so, and he had a quality of stillness in difficult situations that I can only describe as professional, the stillness of a man who has learned to let information arrive at him rather than go searching for it. Victor and my father had run their lines within a few miles of each other for nearly a decade before my father died, and they shared camps, sometimes in bad weather, and helped each other on the rare occasions when help was needed. And I believe they had a friendship of the kind that trappers sometimes develop, which is not marked by many words or many social exchanges, but by a profound mutual legibility, an understanding of each other's competence and limits that functions as a form of trust, more reliable than most declarations of friendship I have witnessed. It was Victor who came to tell us, on the morning of November 17th, 1958, that my father had not returned to his base camp as expected, and that something was wrong. My father had been due at his base camp on the Liard, 40 miles south of Watson Lake, on the 14th. This was his practice, an arrangement he had with my mother, by which she could expect him on a given date and could begin the practical work of concern if he did not arrive. He did not arrive on the 14th, and he did not arrive on the 15th or the 16th, and by the morning of the 17th, my mother had been awake for 2 nights, performing the internal calculations that a trapper's wife performs, which are not calculations of probability but of endurance, of how long she can hold the weight of not knowing before she asks someone to go and look. Victor appeared at our door before she asked. He had come in from his own line the evening before and had known immediately from the state of my father's camp that something had occurred. He told my mother he was going back out and that I should come with him, and I put on my gear and went without being told twice. I was 15 years old. I had been in the bush with my father since I was old enough to walk in snow, and I understood what Victor was not saying, which was that there was a reasonable chance we would find my father dead. I understood this. What I did not understand was what else we would find. We travelled on snowshoe. The temperature that morning was -22 degrees Celsius. I remember because Victor said it aloud when we set out, as a statement of fact rather than complaint, the way a man might note the depth of a creek before crossing it. The sky was clear, and the light was the particular white of a Yukon November that has no warmth in it at all, only brightness. The snow was dry and not deep, perhaps 30 centimeters, which made the travelling easier than it might have been, and we made good time on a trail that Victor knew and that I half knew from having walked it with my father in other seasons. We did not speak much. Victor set a pace, and I matched it, and the only conversation we had in the first 2 hours was when Victor paused at a set of tracks crossing the trail and stood looking at them for a long moment before moving on. I asked him what they were, and he said only that they were not moose and not bear, which was true, and which was something I had already known, and which I filed away without asking further, because the quality of his attention when he looked at those tracks was not the quality of a man encountering something new, but the quality of a man encountering something he had expected. I have thought about that pause for 64 years. I have thought about what Victor knew that I did not know, and what he chose not to tell me, and whether his silence was protective or simply practical. The decision of a man who understood that some things need to be seen before they can be spoken. I have come to believe it was both, and that he was right on both counts. We found my father at 11:40 in the morning, in a small clearing perhaps 200 meters off the main trail, near a creek that ran into the Liard from the northwest, and that my father called the pewter for the colour it turned in freeze-up. He was lying on his back in the snow with his arms at his sides and his face turned slightly upward, in a posture that would have looked peaceful if you did not know what death looked like. And I knew what death looked like, and so I knew immediately. His wool trapper's cap was not on his head. It was set upright on a spruce stump at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 4 meters from where he lay, placed there with a care that was unmistakable. The cap sitting level and deliberate on the flat of the stump, as if someone had put it there so it would not be lost. His old setter dog, Fen, was lying pressed against his side, the dog's head resting on my father's chest, and Fen lifted his head when we came into the clearing, and looked at us, and made no sound at all. Fen was 9 years old, and had been in the bush with my father every season for 8 of those years, and the dog was in a state I can only describe as sustained grief. which is a state I would not have known to name in an animal before that morning, and which I recognized without difficulty. The creature was at the far edge of the clearing. I will take a moment here because this is the part that must be said correctly or not said at all. She was standing at the edge of the clearing where the spruce closed in, at a distance I estimated then at perhaps 25 meters, and she was standing fully upright and entirely still, and she was very large. I am a man who spent 34 years in the field, measuring animals and estimating weights and distances, and I tell you she stood, by my estimate, at 8.5 feet. And I tell you that she weighed somewhere over 500 pounds. And I tell you that she was dark brown, a brown so deep it was nearly black in the shadow of the spruce, with a width of shoulder that I had no reference for, because no animal I had ever seen was built in that proportion. Her face was turned toward us. I saw the face clearly because the light in the clearing was direct and unobstructed, and what I saw was not a face I can fit into any category of face that I have words for, except to say that it was not threatening, and it was not animal in the way that animal usually means. It was old. It was the face of something that had been in that country for a very long time, and that was in a state, at that moment, of a grief so thorough and so unperformed that I felt it as a physical thing, the way you feel the cold coming off a frozen lake before you step onto the ice. Victor stopped walking when we came into the clearing. He did not raise his rifle, which he carried slung. He stood beside me and he put his hand briefly on my arm once, in a gesture that I understood to mean, "Be still and look and do not act." I was still. I looked. I did not act. The creature did not move. We stood in that clearing for what I believe was close to 10 minutes, though I could not have said so with certainty at the time, and in those 10 minutes the creature looked at my father, and then at Victor, and then at me, and looked back at my father, and made, twice, a sound that I have tried for 64 years to find words for, and that I will attempt to describe now with the full knowledge that words will not be sufficient. It was not a cry, it was not a howl or a roar, or any sound I associate with an animal in distress. It was an exhalation, long and low, carried on the cold air with a resonance that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. A sound that had a shape to it, a shape that I can only describe as the acoustic form of a weight that has been carried for a very long time, and that is in this moment set down. She made this sound twice, with a long silence between, looking at my father both times, and then she turned and walked into the spruce, and did not look back. She looked back. That is not what I said, and I am correcting myself now, because precision matters, and because this is one of the facts I have returned to most often in the years since. She did look back, once, from the shadow of the first row of spruce, before she went fully into the timber. She looked back at my father, not at Victor, not at me, at my father lying in the snow with his dog pressed against his side and his cap on the stump. She looked back once, then she was gone. Victor and I stood for a time in the quiet the clearing had become. Fen had not moved from my father's side. The cold was working through my clothing. Victor was the one who moved first, crossing to my father with the careful economy of movement of a man performing a necessary task, and I followed, and we knelt together on the snow beside Gus Desjardins, who was 61 years old, and who had been dead. Victor said, by the state of the body, for 2.5 to 3 days, which put his death at the 14th, which was the day he was due at base camp, the day his heart must have stopped in this clearing, while his dog pressed against him, and while something else, something enormous and dark and present, was already here. She had been here for 3 days. That is what Victor told me, and that is what I came to understand in the hours and days that followed, as we built a camp and sent one of us back for help, and waited with the body in the cold. She had been here since before we arrived. She had been here since my father died, or perhaps since shortly after, and she had not left, and the snow around the edges of the clearing held evidence of her presence that was undeniable, and that Victor read for me without commentary, pointing out where she had stood, and where she had sat, and where she had moved during the 3 days of her vigil. She had not touched my father. She had not moved him, or the dog, or the cap on the stump. She had stood or sat at the edge of the clearing for 3 days in -22°, cold in the dark and the light both, and she had stayed. I do not know what this means. I have 64 years of thinking about it, and I do not know. What I know is what I saw and what Victor told me, and I know those things the way I know my own name. We made our camp that first evening at the edge of the trees, away from the clearing, but close enough that we could see the body and that Fenn, who had finally consented to leave my father's side, could move between the fire and the clearing without going far. Victor built the fire with the economy of a man who has built 10,000 fires and does not think about the process. And I gathered wood, and neither of us spoke for a long stretch of time after the fire was going and the tea was on. The cold had not relented. The sky had come on dark and clear, and the stars above the Liard country were the particular cold stars of a northern November, bright and remote, and numerous in a way that makes a man feel the smallness of a fire very precisely. I sat on my pack and held my cup and looked at the space at the edge of the clearing where she had stood, and I tried to put together what I had seen with what I knew. And the two things would not go together, not that night, not in any framework I possessed at 15 years old, or that I have fully possessed in the 64 years since. I did not cry that night. I did not cry until I was home and my mother had her arms around me and the door was closed, and then I cried for a long time, and my mother held me and said nothing, because she was a woman who understood that some grief needed to be carried out before it could be named. Victor put more wood on the fire around midnight, and we sat for another hour in the way that two people sit when they are both awake and both, thinking about the same thing, and neither of them is ready to speak. It was Victor who spoke first. He said, "Your father was a man of patience." He did not say it as praise, exactly, or as consolation, exactly. He said it as a fact, the way you state a fact about the country that explains something that was otherwise unclear. I said that I knew this was true. Victor said she knew it too. Then he was quiet again, and I sat with what he had said, and after a while he told me what he had seen in the years before my father died. And I listened, and the fire burned down, and the stars moved in their slow arc, and Fenn lay between us, and slept the exhausted sleep of a dog that has been keeping watch for 3 days and has finally been relieved. Victor told me, on the third night in that camp, while we sat by a small fire with the body behind us, and the clearing silent, and the dog finally asleep, that he had known about the creature for 11 years. He had first encountered her tracks in the autumn of 1947, on the same stretch of country where my father ran his line, and that he had seen her twice at a distance before the winter of 1949, when he had seen something that stopped him from speaking of it to anyone for 9 years. He had come into a camp of my father's one morning, in late November, a camp my father used in the middle stretch of his line, and he had found my father sitting on a spruce round outside the tent, and the creature sitting on the ground a few meters away, and the two of them had been, in Victor's word, visiting. I asked him what he meant by visiting, and he said he meant that they were in each other's company in the way that two beings are when neither of them intends to leave immediately and when neither of them is afraid. He said, my father had seen him come into the clearing and had not moved and had not spoken, only looked at Victor with an expression that Victor described as a man asking for a particular kind of courtesy, and Victor had understood the courtesy being asked for. And he had backed out of the clearing and gone on with his day, and the two men had never spoken of it until that fire on that third night, with my father dead behind them in the snow. Victor said he had seen them together 3 more times after that first encounter. Once in the spring, at a distance, once in early winter, when he had seen the creature leave something at the entrance to my father's camp and walk away before my father emerged from the tent, and he had watched my father find the thing and stand holding it for a long time in the cold without going back inside. He could not see from his distance what the thing was. The last time he had seen them together was the autumn before my father died, which was the autumn of 1957, and he had seen them walking together at the edge of a frozen lake in the last light of a November afternoon, walking in the same direction at approximately the same pace, with perhaps 3 meters between them, and Victor said that the word he had reached for then, and that he was reaching for, again now, was companionship, which was a word he used carefully, and which he was not willing to revise. I tell you this as Victor told it to me, without embellishment and without interpretation beyond what I have offered, which is small. I was 15 years old and I heard these things, and I stored them in a place where they have remained for 64 years, being examined at intervals by the man I was becoming. And I tell you that each examination has convinced me more fully than the last that Victor was, telling the truth, and that he was telling it carefully, and that he was telling it in the way a man tells a truth he has been rehearsing for a very long time, waiting for the right occasion. There were 6 of us, in the end, who knew the full account of my father's death and what was found in that clearing. Victor and I, who had been there. My mother, Agnes, to whom I told everything when I came home, because she was a woman who knew the country and who would not be broken by the truth of it, and who said only, when I finished, that she had wondered, and that she was not surprised, and that my father had been loved in that country, in ways she had always known she could not account for. A man named Denny Ouellette, who was a trapper of my father's generation, and who came with the group that retrieved the body, and who saw the clearing and the evidence in the snow before the weather changed it. Dennis was 61 years old and had been in the Yukon bush since before the war, an angular, deliberate man who wore the same style of canvas jacket every season and who had a reputation among the other trappers for being constitutionally incapable of exaggeration, a man whose word in any factual matter was treated by his community as something close to documentary. He walked into the clearing on the morning of the 18th, behind the 2 younger men who had come with him, and he stopped walking when he saw the tracks at the edge of the spruce, and he stood looking at them for a longer time than I had expected from a man of his composure. I watched his face, What I saw there was not disbelief, and it was not shock. It was more nearly recognition, the slow adjustment of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is now being confirmed. He looked at the cap on the stump. He looked at where my father had lain, the body already wrapped and ready to carry out. He looked at Victor, who returned his look without speaking, and some understanding passed between the two men that I could see but could not read. The kind of understanding that moves between people who have been in the same country for a long time and who share certain baseline assumptions about what the country contains. Denny said nothing to the other two men who had come with him. He said nothing to me until weeks later, when he came to sit with our family in the way that men of his generation came to sit after a death, formally and at an appointed time, with a bottle of rye and a willingness to be present. That was itself a form of condolence. He sat across the kitchen table from me, and he said that a man could do worse than to be mourned the way Gus had been mourned, and that he hoped someone would say the same for him one day. Then he poured 2 glasses, and we sat in silence for a while, and that was sufficient, and that was everything either of us needed to say. And Dennis kept the secret until the day he died, which was in the spring of 1973. And he died with it whole and undamaged, the way he had received it. Madeline, who was my wife from 1966 or onward, and who I told on the night of our engagement, because I believed I owed her the full truth of the world I was bringing her into. She was 24 years old then, I was 23, and we were sitting in the kitchen of her parents' house in Watson Lake, with the lamp burning between us and the November wind coming hard off the Liard Valley, and I told her everything I have told you here, in the same order, taking the same care. She listened without interrupting. She asked, when I finished, how long Victor and I had been at the camp before the others came, and I said 2 nights. She asked whether the dog had been well, whether Fen had eaten and drunk, and I said he had, that he had eaten what we offered him on the 2nd night, though not the first. She said she was satisfied, and that what I had told her was something she wanted to know, and was glad to know, and would carry carefully. She did not ask me to explain it further, and she did not offer an explanation herself, and in the 56 years of our marriage she returned to the subject, perhaps a dozen times, always late at night, always with the lamp low, and always with the quality of attention she brought to the most serious things in her life, which was complete and unhurried, and free of any need to resolve what could not be resolved. She said once that she thought the creature and my father had understood something that most people are given only brief glimpses of, if they are given any at all, and that the 3 days in the clearing were the fullest expression of that understanding she could imagine. Madeline died on the 19th of January, and I was with her when she went. And the last coherent thing she said to me the afternoon before was that I should tell Clara and not be afraid of what Clara would do with it, because Clara was a woman with the same quality of careful attention that Madeline had, and she would know how to hold it. I believe Madeline was right. I am trusting her judgment now. And a Casca elder named Thomas Squirrel, who was my mother's uncle, and who came to me the spring after my father died, and told me that he was not surprised either, and that the creature my father had known was one that the old people in his family had known in that country for a very long time, and that they had a word for what she was that he was not going to translate into English, because English did not have a vessel for it, but that what he could tell me was that she was old, older than my father would have understood by old, and that she had been in that watershed then longer than the oldest story Thomas knew, and that the relationship my father had built with her over 14 years was not, by the understanding of Thomas's family, an impossible thing, but only an uncommon one, the kind of relationship that required a particular quality of patience on the human side and a particular quality of discernment on her side, and that Gus Desjardins had apparently had both. Thomas said this without sentiment and without mysticism. He said it the way he said most things, as information, as a fact about the world that he had held, and that it was now appropriate to pass on. I have thought about what Thomas said for 64 years. I do not know more than I knew after that conversation. I know what he told me, and I hold it the way he gave it to me, carefully and without addition. The government sent a man out in December to take the official account of my father's death. I spoke to him, and I told him my father had died of a cardiac event in the bush, which was true, and that we had found him with his dog and had brought him home, which was also true. I did not tell him about the clearing, or the cap on the stump, or the 3 days of vigil, or the tracks in the snow. Victor told him the same. Denis told him the same. The government man wrote in his report that Gustave Desjardins, aged 61, had died of natural causes in the field and had been recovered by family and associates. This is the official record. It is not the full truth. I have not lost a single night of sleep over the difference, and I do not expect to lose any now. My mother kept the cap. She brought it back from the clearing herself, on the day we packed out, carrying it inside her coat, because she would not put it in a bag. She kept it on the same shelf as the bird skull and the folded birch bark until she moved in with my sister Claudette in the late 1980s, and then she gave it to me, and I have kept it since. It is a dark wool cap, the kind my father wore, and there is nothing remarkable about it, except that it is still intact after 64 years, and that my mother handled it with a care that was not, I understood even as a boy, about sentiment. She was keeping it because someone had placed it on that stump. She was keeping it because the placing of it was a form of speech she had no other record of. In the years after my father's death, I went back to the Pewter Creek drainage many times, first as a young man trapping some of the same country and later as a warden, and I looked for evidence of the creature on each of those trips, without making a project of it, the way a person looks for a particular bird when they are already in the bush for other reasons. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I did not set out to find her. I did not build my roots around the possibility of encountering her, and I did not keep a formal record of what I found and what I did not find. What I did was pay attention to the country the way my father had taught me to pay attention, which is to say, fully and without preconceptions about what deserved attention and what did not. And once a year or so, in the Pewter Creek drainage or the country immediately east of it, I would come across evidence that I recognized, and I would stand with it for a time, and then I would go on with my work. I found her tracks on 4 occasions over the course of 30 years. The first time was in the autumn of 1961, 3 years after my father died, and the tracks were fresh, perhaps a day old, and they crossed a muskeg flat. I knew well and went into a stand of black spruce, so dense I could not have followed them without cutting my way through. I stood at the edge of that stand for a while. I did not go in. I told myself it was because the terrain was impractical, and that was partly true and partly not. The second time was in the winter of 1968, when I was a new warden and learning the full extent of my patrol area, and I found a trail of tracks in the fresh snow of a meadow on a south-facing bench above the Liard, and I followed them for perhaps 400 meters before they went into the timber on a slope too steep and unstable for safe travel in those conditions, and I turned back. The third time, in the early 1970s, I found the remains of a kill site, a moose that had died that winter, and around the site in the snow were tracks that told a story I recognized, of something large and patient that had been there after the wolves and had taken what remained, not in the manner of a bear or a wolverine, not in the tearing or dragging manner of a predator, but more selectively, more carefully, in the way of a being that understood what it needed and took only that. The fourth and last time was in the autumn of 1989, by which time I estimated, from the stride length and depth, that she was moving more slowly than the earlier tracks I had known, and that whatever age means for a being like her, she was in a later portion of it. I did not see her. I stood on the shore of a frozen lake and looked at the tracks leading away into the spruce. And I thought about my father walking on that same shore 30 years before in the last light of a November afternoon, and about what Victor had seen and what Victor had called companionship. And I thought about the 14 years and the small gifts carried out of the bush and placed on a windowsill without explanation. And I thought about the sound she had made in the clearing, the long exhalation that I had felt in my chest, and I thought that I had spent my whole working life in this country, and that the country had kept its largest truth at a careful distance from me, and had offered me only these glimpses, these partial exposures, these refusals of the full picture, and that this was right. I was not the person that truth was offered to fully. My father was. And whatever she had been to him and he to her, it was theirs. And the measure of it was a 3-day vigil in -22 degrees on the Liard watershed. And no measurement I have in my professional vocabulary is adequate to that measure. Madeline said something to me once, perhaps 15 years ago, when we were sitting up late in this kitchen and talking about my father the way we did sometimes in the quieter years of our life together. She said that she thought the hardest part of it for me must be not knowing what they had, my father and the creature, not knowing what the visits meant, or what passed between them, or whether what they had was a thing that could be called by any name she or I would recognize. I told her she was right, that it was hard not to know. She said that she thought the not knowing was also, in some sense, the point, that a relationship that could be fully described and categorized and named was not the same kind of relationship that required 14 years of patience to build and 3 days of vigil to honor. She said this without sentiment, in the way Madeline said most things of importance to her, as an observation rather than a consolation. Then she was quiet for a while, and she poured what was left in the pot into both our cups. And she said one other thing, which was that she thought my father had understood, somewhere in those 14 years, that the country he loved and the being he had come to know were not separate things, that his love for the Liard watershed and whatever had grown between him and the creature were expressions of the same reaching, the same quality of attention sustained over a very long time, and that the 3 days she had stood in that clearing were her answer to 20 years. Of that attention, the fullest answer she had available to give. I have sat with that for 15 years, and I believe Madeline was right. The way she was right about most things she chose to apply herself to. I am not running out of words. I am running out of the kind of words that are appropriate to this account, which is a different problem. I know that what I have described will be received differently by different people who hear it. I know that some will not believe me, which is their right. I know that some will believe me and will want to interpret what they believe, to place it inside a system of understanding that makes it explicable and therefore manageable. And I am not going to help them do that, because I do not have an explanation and have never had one, and have made my peace with the absence of one. What I have is what I saw, and what Victor told me, and what Thomas told me, and what my mother kept on her shelf for 40 years, and what I have kept on my shelf since then, and what I found in the snow at Pewter Creek 4 times in 30 years, of looking without making a project of it. I have one other thing. I mentioned that the creature looked back from the shadow of the first spruce before she went into the timber. I said she looked back at my father. That is also not entirely what happened, and I am correcting myself again, because precision is the only form of honesty I have left, and Madeline deserves the full account, even if she cannot hear it now. The creature looked back at my father, and then she looked at me. She held my gaze for a moment that I cannot measure in seconds, because time stopped operating in the ordinary way during that moment. And what I understood in that held gaze, standing in the snow at 15 years old, with my father dead behind me, and his dog lying against him, and his cap on the stump, was not a message, and not a farewell, and not a recognition, or it was all three, and also something that none of those words contains. I have thought about that gaze for 64 years. I have thought about it more since Madeline died than at any other time in my life, because I am now the last person who knows what I know, and the gaze feels different now than it did when Madeline was alive, heavier and more specific, as if it was always intended for this particular moment in my life. And I only understand now what it was saying then. I do not know if that is wisdom, or if that is an old man manufacturing, meaning in a cold kitchen in March. I am not going to decide. I am going to say it and leave it, and trust Clara to know what to do with it, the way my mother trusted the cap on the shelf, to go on saying what it was saying without anyone needing to explain. My father was a trapper on the Liard watershed for 20 years, and for the last 14 of those years, he was in a relationship with a being I cannot name and whose nature I cannot explain. And when he died alone in the snow, she was there, and she stayed for 3 days. And when we came, she let us see her grieving, and then she went into the timber. And the world is more full and more old and more faithful than any of the systems I was given to understand it will ever be able to hold. I am Harold Desjardins. I am 78 years old. I was born in Watson Lake, in the Yukon Territory, and this is the truest account I have.